Sitzt an altem Mamele und tracht. Es ist schon spät bei Nacht, doch sitzt sie beim Fenster, treurig und wart auf ihr Kind. Heut bist du zurück, du schöne Zeit. Es ducht an Ewigkeit, doch.
The gathering of all of you is what the book was about. It was doing it for all the people who are represented by who's here. I have family from both sides, from the Shapiro side and the Korzik side, from as far away as Uruguay and from around the corner. So it's pretty remarkable. I want to be clear about what I'm doing today. This is the book I'm talking about. And, oops, how do I get it on camera? I'm not going to be telling what the book tells. I'm going to tell how in the world it was possible to do this. And I want to start by asking you to do something before I tell my story. And that is to be quiet for a minute in your head and think back to your own grandparents, to a place when you saw things that belonged to one or both or all of your grandparents. Focus on one object so that you can see it clearly in your head, and write a note if you can so you'll remember what you saw. Okay, we'll come back to that. As David explained, most of the objects that formed my research base have been given to the Yeshiva University Museum. So I don't have those things anymore, but I'm going to talk about them and what I learned from them. I have one piece I discovered I hadn't given them. And this is a matzah cover from Jerusalem. And when I was showing it to David yesterday or the day before yesterday, he said, well, how did that come into the family? That's the key question. What's this thing doing as part of the family story? So between when David and I spoke on Friday, I guess it was, till today, I've been able to Google around and find out when this matzah cover was made, which was 1819 or so. And it was a response to a huge problem of orphans who were in Jerusalem. And what is unknown right now, so far to me, is whether this was a response, a gift in thanks for a tzedakah, a contribution to the orphanage in Jerusalem, or what. I don't know how it came to the family, but anyway, that's an example of what I had. I want to say a little bit about my childhood experience, because it isn't just the objects, it's very much my own faith in God and my own attraction to religious life that made me pursue this project. I felt a connection to my grandparents that I never understood. I never met my grandfather. I was named after him. And my mother was pregnant with me when he passed. So that's a very big kind of connection in my mind. I did know my grandmother. She died when I was 7. I have very strong positive memories of her, but very, very little information. There was another thing about my childhood that was really intense. And it was that on Friday nights, when we went to my grandmother's house, and then that became my aunt's house in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, I would go outside in the summertime and I would hear this amazing chanting and see what I now know were Lubavitcher Hasidim praying on Friday night with the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Nobody ever told me who they were. Nobody ever tried to explain why they were there. And when I grew up till 10 years ago, I didn't even know, 15 years ago maybe, I didn't even know who those people were. But I made a painting of that scene I saw, which is now in the Brooklyn Museum. And now I know much more about what I saw. But that's an introduction to say what I think is true of anyone of the generation I'm of who had ancestors from Eastern Europe. And that is the silence. No one told us anything. Nobody talked about how it was, why they had come, why they spoke differently, what languages even they spoke. I find it phenomenal how there are two analogies I have to the silence. And the strongest one is the silence that followed survivors of the Holocaust who would not speak about what they had seen for very good reasons. And lo and behold, I found out again, there were very, very, very good reasons to not talk about what these people had seen and what they had left behind. And what's so complicated is that what they left behind wasn't only pogroms and persecution and exclusion and all those things that I document in the book, but there also was the highest level of intellectual and religious life probably anywhere in the world. And these people, many of them, and we're going to talk about not all of them, but how that there was a class of people who participated in the yeshiva world that have a level of learning and devoutness that is beyond what anything I can imagine. So what I wanted to really set as a ground to my process was how very difficult it is to understand the world these people left. It's not comparable to anything I know. So I didn't understand the Lubavitchers. I didn't understand my own grandparents. Nobody told me anything. I do remember the brass samovar, which I was told was from Lithuania, and that disappeared. I never knew where that went. But there were a Lithuanian platter that had a very important history that I was able to unearth. Portraits, there were drawings and paintings, there were textiles akin to this matzah cover. My grandfather's hand washing cup survived. Quite miraculously, all this stuff came to me when my parents, I must have wanted it. It's the only thing my sister didn't want anything from our parents' house, and I said, I want everything. So I got everything. But that meant I had to figure out what in the world all this stuff was. And as I was telling David Ellis, the gentleman who introduced me, objects don't talk. That's a big problem. You have a lot of objects, but you don't know what in the world they are, what they're a piece of. And of course you want to think you know, but you don't. And it takes a lot of humility to begin to say, I have no idea. But I had some very lucky helps. One of the lucky helps was when I approached Yeshiva University Museum and said, would you like all this family stuff? And explained who my grandfather had been, that he had founded 3 Talmud Torahs in Brooklyn, and that he was known as the Dean of Rabbis of Brooklyn. They were very impressed, and they had a committee meeting, and they saw all the photographs, and they said, we want them. So great. They wanted them, but there was a problem. I wasn't ready to give them. So year after year, I would make excuses and I'd say, I'm not ready yet. Then something very lucky happened. And I credit this to Dunkin' Donuts and to Hashem. I was in Dunkin' Donuts talking with a friend who's with us today, and a third person overheard our conversation. And we were talking about Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. And this new person I didn't know said, may I join you? And she said, I'm interested in what you're talking about. So we talked about these classes that we take and whatever. And then I said, and what do you do? And she said, I help people write family memoirs. Her name is Leah Abrams and her company is Mixed Media Memoirs. And I said, you're hired. Almost that fast. I don't know, Leah, you can correct me, but it feels to me it was that fast. She was exactly the person I needed at that moment. The reason I couldn't give the material to the Yeshiva Museum, University Museum, I was reluctant to let it go because I know a lot about museums, and I know museums put things in drawers and they stay in drawers. And unless you make a story and you know the history behind them, they're going to stay in drawers. So I only understood much later why I had been so reluctant. Besides that, I'm a pack rat and I like family stuff. I really couldn't just send them off without a history. So Leah came along and we worked together. And originally what we were going to do is make what museums call an object list, which is a kind of history of each piece and a description of each piece. And now that object list is in the book. It's a piece of the book, but it's not, there's much more here because then another person joined the team, and that is Rachel Rinderman, now Fabish, who is a brilliant graphic designer who made this a very, very beautiful book. And when we sat together, the three of us, she said, you can't just do an objects list. You need to tell the story. So I had two people saying, you need to say more. So how did I do it? This is kind of miraculous. Everybody who wants to do a family story, you only can work with what you have. So you have to kind of inventory, what do I have? What do I know? What do I remember that I was ever told, okay? Well, one thing I started with that turned out to be a gold mine was something I didn't own. And it was 12 letters that my Uncle Nat, the eldest child of the rabbi in Rebbitzin, had saved and given to the archives, the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati, Ohio. So my grandfather's smichas, his ordination papers, and other letters of reference for him to get jobs when he was here in America. So there are letters from Lithuania and there are letters from New York. But they didn't mean anything to me. They were in Hebrew or in Yiddish. Beautiful script. I love beautiful things and I love the script, but I couldn't do anything with them. So that led to my next theme, which is asking for help. The reason people don't explore their family histories is that they think they have to do it all by themselves, I think. And I was, I must say, extremely successful in getting wonderful helpers. It all began with Professor Jonathan Sarna, who I met through my shul in Waltham, right next to Brandeis. And I was then writing about New England history, so I had skills in doing history. And when I met Professor Sarna, I said, I need to learn from you. Little chutzpahdik. So he said, come take my class. So I spent a year learning from this brilliant professor. And I got the big picture of what was happening with Jews coming to America. It was a huge eye-opener. So then we still have all these documents. Actually, Jonathan Sarnick did something else more than that lecture. He said, I'll help you find what I can about your grandfather and his family. And he found that there were two half-brothers who, one had lived in Ohio and one who had lived in Seattle. They came from Lithuania to Ohio and Seattle. I said, why would someone from Lithuania go to Dayton, Ohio? Or Canton, Ohio it was. And he had some very interesting thoughts, which I think were absolutely right. But I don't want to get into too much detail right now. But okay, so I had this team of people who were going to help me put this book together, but I had to do a lot of learning. I want to acknowledge the people who helped me because it's absolutely crucial. Rabbi Daniel, who is my teacher and my friend and who's here with us today, and who wrote the foreword to the book, kept saying something that turned out to be absolutely pivotal. And that was that America lost 2 generations. When the immigrants came in the 1880s and 90s, there were no schools. There was no way to learn what it meant to be Jewish, to learn Jewish texts, to learn Tanakh, to learn anything. And at the same time, there was New York's free public schools that taught children the basic secular subjects. So it isn't surprising that of the rabbi of my grandfather's 8 children, all of them became secular. All of them. I'm the only, as far as I know, of the grandchildren who is involved with Jewishness at all. I may be proven wrong. Some people are present today from the family. If I'm wrong, I'd love to be wrong. But anyway, I'm part of the 2 generations that got taught some very strange things. When I went to Hebrew school, the content of the curriculum was the Holocaust. Scared me. That's all it did. It scared me. It never taught me the richness of Judaism, the power of, the only thing, and I want to credit my mom here, my mother, when I was little, taught me to pray. And lo and behold, very recently, I realized, of course, she grew up in the old world, even though it was in Brooklyn. She spoke Yiddish. She wrote Yiddish, but she never told me. And there wasn't a clue that she spoke Yiddish, except a postcard that I recently found that her mother wrote to her when she was young in Yiddish. Anyway, I'm going a little bit in circles to explain a very complicated process. So Rabbi Fleer was essential. He would tell me about different rabbis who came in New York, and there are all those stories I tell in the book. The other rabbi who was extremely important is Rabbi Moshe Lieberman, who is the Chabad rabbi of Newton Center. And I lived right near there then, and I would hop over many times and say, will you translate this? Will you explain this? And he did both. And what he had that I could get from nowhere else was not a sense, but I felt like he knew lineage of certain families back into Lithuania. It wasn't a brick wall for him. There was a past there, and a masterful, magnificent past. That's the whole part that was missing for me. And the other person who was a great encourager was Rabbi Chaim Kramer, who is a founder of the Breslov Research Institute. And he was like a cheerleader for me to write this thing. So I just want to credit that. And I want to say one other helper who I know is here today, and that is my nephew, Jonathan Franklin. I knew Jonathan was a computer whiz, and he is a librarian at the University of Washington in Seattle. And I said, how would you like to help me find obscure documents to flesh out this story? And it's to Jonathan's credit that I found, or he found, and it's published in the book, the New York Times article on the horrific ship that brought my grandfather alone in 1892. The ship, get this, was called the Red Sea. And it was supposed to be some miraculous transport to the New World, but it was a total nightmare. There was illness, there was bad food, it was so bad that when the ship got to Brooklyn, where it came to port, the New York people who checked those things didn't want to accept any of them. They almost sent them all back. But then that whole account of the Red Sea is in the book, thanks to Jonathan's work. I want to sort of wrap up my part by saying that I'm still learning. Every time I look at, when I reread the book in preparation for doing this today, I thought, oh my God, I missed that opportunity. I missed that connection. There are still things I'm learning. But for those of you who may want to have Brooklyn roots and want to do something like what I did, I want to tell you two extraordinary source books without which I could not have done this book. One of them is a book called The History of Brooklyn Jewry. It was published in 1937 by a man named Samuel Abelow. He was a newspaper man, and he had the smarts to collect everything he could and compile. He has all kinds of detail in there on the history of all the different institutions of Jewish learning, of the different synagogues. The history of education is a key piece in there. And he tells about the different schools. So of course, I'm able to find the schools my grandfather helped found. But in it, amazingly, you never know what you're going to find. That's the thing I want to convey that's so fun about research. In that book, I found a weird description, I mean, weird to me because it was so surprising, of the event at which my parents met. And there's a whole reason that mattered. It was a part of Brooklyn social history, but they were brought into this process to help broaden the outreach to the younger Jews, the same kind of thing that CJP is trying to do now, okay? And that many other Jewish organizations do to bring in the new generation. The other book I want to tell you about, which I call the scariest book I ever read, is The Atlas of Jewish History, written by Martin Gilbert. And the maps in that book I have reproduced in my book. Oh, there's one other book, and that's very important, that I know thanks to Rabbi Lieberman, and that is David Katz's book called Lithuanian Jewish History, which is like a huge fat book with a huge amount of information. And it turns out that the author of that book came from his father came from the same little shtetl that my grandfather had come from, so we had a bond over that. I want to just wrap up saying I welcome questions, and I would be happy also to meet with any of you who want to discuss this further. This was a speed trip through the process of doing the book. But if any of you want to talk more about the process, more about the findings or how to do it, how I did it, I'd be happy. David is going to put my email in the chat room. And if you want to order the book, you can also order it with shipping. It's $19. And other than that, I'm open to questions.
Okay, several of us in the chat had relatives. My Lithuanian grandmother that I knew, for some reason, went to Columbus, Ohio, and we have no idea why. Eventually, her husband, Nathan Rothstein, died in Ohio, and then she moved back to New York. But I found this out by DNA matches and doing a lot of research, and I have documents. But you said you asked someone, why would anyone go to Ohio, and you didn't want to go into it. But many of us have Lithuanian relatives, I've looked in the chat, that went to Ohio. So tell me, why Ohio?
and different, and many of them moved. The one who was my grandfather's half brother went from Ohio to Utica, New York. It reflects my provincialism.
Of course, we're New York, we're East Coast people.
Centers on New York City, which of course it doesn't. But also, it was Jonathan Sarna who said the answer that I found very interesting, and that is that by going to a small community, he could lead that community, but he also would have time to learn, and that learning time was really important. And I thought,
Okay, we have another question, and this is a very general and an important question. And this is, how did you do the research in Eastern Europe? Can you expand on that?
Oh, I didn't explain that. Very important. Thank you. Obviously, I didn't go there. I mean, not obviously, but I didn't go there. But I wouldn't have found there what I needed anyway. I don't know if all of you are aware, but in World War II, all the Jews who were left in Lithuania were murdered, town by town by town. So there are people to learn about what happened in the period I'm trying to understand. I relied on those 12 documents that were in the Cincinnati American Jewish Archives. And I have right here the list. They represent maybe 9 different towns. There were rabbis teaching in different towns, in Vilkomir, in Slobodka, in Yanova, in Kovna, in Shevzhan, in Preb. So I got a geography through the signers of the letters, and then I was able to get a sense of what they were doing there, if I could find them. And then some of those, like the chief rabbi of Moscow, Chaim Yaakov Vidrovitz, was from Moscow, but then he came to New York. And the letter between my grandfather and him was from New York. So that's how I fleshed out the Eastern European story. By the way, there's something I can add. There's a new YouTube called Jews of Lithuania with marvelous lectures by a Rabbi David Katz, not the same one who wrote the book I referred to earlier. And he has the most subtle description of the economics and social class situation in Eastern Europe. You asked how I listen and pick up little pieces from everywhere. And what I found remarkable in Rabbi Katz, this is Rabbi David Katz of Baltimore, he described a world that I hadn't even imagined in writing the book. I only encountered him recently. And he talked about the dynasties and the wealth that came with the dynasties of rabbis and the political power that came. We know the word Yiddish, yichus. Many of you know the word yichus probably, but yichus is very serious stuff. It explains the whole structure of how that society worked. And there were people who had a lot of control, and there were people who were very impoverished. And people from both stratas and everywhere in between fled to America. So the people who came here represent that whole spectrum. So that's a little answer about a very big question.
May I speak? Emily Korzenik, relative to Diana, my dear Diana. whom I have loved since I met her when she was 9 years old. And I'm so proud of her. We both share a great delight and wonder and pride in our Jewish heritage. And we express it in perhaps slightly different ways, but it all comes to the same wonderful sharing that we have had throughout the years. Much, much love to you, my dear, and thank you for the beautiful
Thank you, Emily. I want to say that Emily was one of the first women to be ordained as a rabbi.
Really? Yes.
Diana, Stan Morse has a question. Do we want to?
I don't know. It was my understanding that most of the Jews in South Africa were from Lithuania. How did the Jews who went to South Africa differ from Lithuanian Jews who came to the United States?
Well, I'm going to answer you in, that's a very rich question that I really can't, I want to answer it in the best way I can, which is to refer you to an incredible book called The Girl on Human Street. I'm right now, Cohen is that, Roger Cohen, he's a New York Times journalist who wrote that book. And he talks about the flow, the migration to South Africa, and then ultimately to London and to New York in extremely subtle, important ways. I don't know what other destinations my grandparents might have considered. I know the Korzenik family, which was, I mean, the whole Poland-Lithuania thing is also very complicated. I used to think, my parents used to say, oh, we're a mixed marriage. The Korzeniks were Poles and Czech and the other side was Lithuania, but it was much more interrelated than that. But in any case, the Korzenik side of the family did go to Lithuania, and I had cousins who were there and I corresponded with them. But that's a whole different story. I don't know.
Just a quick comment. Many of the Jews in South Africa came from a particular area in Lithuania, the area around Kovno and Slobodka.
Okay.
And there was a flood of immigrants from Lithuania to South Africa after 1924, when the United States started closing down immigration.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
There was earlier immigration as well, I think you'll find. Remember that there was a very significant famine in Lithuania in the 1870s, and South Africa was rather eager to attract. The British were rather eager to bring people to South Africa, and there were Jews who thought that was a better opportunity. There are plenty of Jews in Boston who have relatives who chose to go to South Africa, whereas they chose to come to the United States. But lots of them felt that they had no choice but to leave. And the fact that the railroad had made it into Lithuania by then, which was not true further east, made it much easier to go to cities from Lithuania.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. Can I speak about this African situation?
Yeah. Who's speaking?
My name is Farrell Baczynski. Very interesting listening to this. I was born and raised in South Africa. My father's, well, of my 4 grandparents, 3 were born and raised in Lithuania. 1 was born in South Africa of Lithuanian parents. And so several things. Yes, somebody who said the Immigration and Naturalization Act of the fall of 1924 did a lot for that. So my father's 4 older siblings had gone from Rogova, just south east of Panaves. They'd gone from there they'd come to the United States. And when he tried to join them, he and a friend went to the port of Hamburg and they went to try board a ship, and they said, no, you need a visa. And they said, where do you get a visa? You go to the consulate. They went to the consulate, and they said, we're all out of visas. And so the friend said, well, I got family in South Africa. Why don't we go there? And that's the story I've heard.
Interesting.
But the other thing that here within the United States, I think Lithuanian Jews constitute about 15% of Jewry, whereas in South Africa it constitutes 85% of Jewry.
Ah,
That's very
that's
nice.
very interesting. Very important.
We have another question on chat from Alice Poltorick. What surprised you the most during your research?
I think what surprised me the most was the awe I felt about the learning. That makes me still want to learn, to study Tanakh and to learn what I can from teachers who can still pass that knowledge on to me. I didn't realize what a fountain it was going to be, what a huge source for the rest of my life.
Very good. Any more questions?
Can you hear me?
Who's speaking?
This is Joyce Shapiro, wife of Joshua Shapiro, who is, I guess you're...
We're related.
Yes, his father and your father, and your grandfathers were brothers. Half brothers, right. So it goes back to the Ohio question, if I might. Because it's interesting, and there are so many small towns throughout the U.S. that one could have gone to, and yet there was this migration to Ohio. Is there any other further thoughts or ideas that you have that you found that could explain that?
I don't know, but I would like to ask Jonathan Sarna if he can address that.
I mean, it's, first of all, the phenomenon is absolutely correct. Canton was really a bastion of Lithuanian Jews. Some of them, when the Lithuanian Jews, remember, liked natural resources, and they went for oil, and that's why they later went out to Oklahoma, where Tulsa is a heavily Lithuanian city still, because of the familiarity with oil, and the most famous Jew who made that migration, a Lithuanian rabbi named Bernard Revel, who's the first president of the Yeshiva University. You can also find in Jewish newspapers, meaning Yiddish newspapers, there would be advertisements encouraging people to move away from New York, come to smaller communities, which of course is what they were used to in Lithuania. A great big New York was very different from the kind of shtetl life that many of them had known. And so the idea of moving to the Midwest had promise, and there were opportunities in the Midwest that didn't quite exist in New York. In New York at this time, the clothing is ramping up, but that really entailed working in a factory. For those who didn't want to do that, moving west held all sorts of opportunities, and that's especially true for those who came early, meaning prior to 1900, which, as I said earlier, was when the Lithuanian Jews predominated. Of course, there also were rabbis who came, and they tended to be sent to different communities that needed rabbis. They'd write back to one of the great rabbis of Lithuania, where the yeshivas were. They said, we have the perfect person for you, and off they would go. A famous example of that would be Rabbi Tobias Geffen, for so many years, the sort of chief rabbi of Atlanta. So, you know, it's a complicated story, and each person is individual, but it's easy to understand why the Midwest held all sorts of allure that folks may not have found in very large East Coast cities.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
The other thing that amazed me in looking at the two half-brothers, particularly Baruch Shapiro, who was out in Seattle, he traveled everywhere. They got on trains and went to speak. And I have a lot of thanks to someone who's done research, Ellie Genau, who's done research in Seattle. I have lots of speeches that were given by this itinerant Rabbi Baruch Shapiro, who was Daniel's other half-brother. So getting around, I think they were really celebrities.
I have a question. This is Ruth Broidy Sharon.
Yes.
Congratulations. I'm the sister of Leah Abrahams, the oral historian. And she was so excited to be working on this project with you because I heard on the other end of some of these stories. So congratulations. My question, two questions. Number one is, why don't you open this up to the general public rather than keeping the publication private? And the second question is, you mentioned that of all in your family, the majority of the people who came here became secular very quickly. And I find that kind of surprising. One would think it would take more generations for them not to pay attention to their Jewish heritage. Why do you think that is?
Okay, it's a very important question. Money was the be-all and end-all. People came, I'm just speaking, this is not a generalization. This is my maternal family. There were 8 children. They all became, not all became wealthy, but they all aspired to become wealthy. The things that came to me that were said about my grandfather were negative. He wasn't interested in them. He was always upstairs in his study. I think he was trying to live the life he wanted to live, and it wasn't the American life. And there was a disconnect. And then back to what Rabbi Fleer said, there was nowhere to teach them. After they could learn at home, there was, and nor were they interested. I think it's very important that they kind of made fun of the past. And I think they were embarrassed by their parents' accents and their not being American. There's a very important part of the book, which is the formation of the Brooklyn Jewish Center, which was the hub of conservative Jewry. It was practically around the corner from my grandparents' house. It was also very close to Crown Heights. That was a shul to which people drove on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in limousines. Okay, whole other thing was going on with that generation. Now, I want to add something else, though, Ruth, to give credit where credit is due. Nat, the eldest of the rabbi's 8 children, was brilliant, and he had a public school education and then went to Brooklyn Law School, when Brooklyn Law School let you be a student on credit. He had no money, but he became a lawyer, and then he got elected to the New York State legislature, and it was he who passed the first, or proposed and saw to the passing of the first kosher laws in New York State. But he didn't break with loyalty with his parents in that respect. But I wouldn't be surprised if their house wasn't even kosher.
Thank you.
We have another question from Debbie. Is there important information that you came about after publishing your book? Will there be anything more forthcoming?
I don't know. I'm still learning. Every time I I'm learning all the time, and I never know what's going to lead to what. I was doing New England history, and all of a sudden this became my priority. I'm very interested in people's spiritual lives, and that's a little different than history. I mean, I've been interested in, I'm writing something else about a New England descendant, and it's actually very interesting, parallel. I'm writing now about a woman who was the granddaughter of a German Jew who came to the colonies in 1750. And the question I have is the same. What happened to that Jewish legacy? And that's a really interesting other story, which I hope to publish.
Okay, if there are no further questions.
Can I say something? Moshe Lieberman here.
Yes.
You're talking about what happened to the Jewish legacy. So I know Diana knows this, but I want to say the following. The Brooklyn Jewish Center. I grew up on Eastern Parkway. The Brooklyn Jewish Center at 667 Eastern Parkway. I grew up at 724 Eastern Parkway. And from the 2nd grade through the 8th grade, I attended school in the yeshiva that was in the Brooklyn Jewish Center. We had a minyan in the shul. The larger sanctuary across the hall still had an ongoing minyan from the conservative congregation that was going on there. And when they didn't get a minyan, they'd come say Kaddish at our minyan. I grew up with those people from the Brooklyn Jewish Center. Subsequently, that building transferred, and it's today belongs to the yeshiva. So whatever went on there, whatever the building founders intended, still continues to function. In fact, the children of the members of that conservative shul are quite involved with the yeshiva that's functioning there today, despite whatever their Korean affiliation is. And that's an interesting phenomenon worthy of further looking into.
I'm very glad you said that.
I want to say that about another institution as well, the Crown Heights Yeshiva and Talmud Torah, which built that building at 310 Crown Street, which is today the girls' school in Crown Heights, where my wife went to school and where my mother teaches and where her mother teaches and our daughter attends, and now has a plaque in memory of your grandfather.
Yeah.
And in that building, there is a congregation that meets on Shabbos. Not part of the school, it's still the original shul. The rabbi of that shul, Rabbi Bogomilsky, whom I work with regularly, who is much older than I am, knew your Uncle Baruch very well, and visited him in Seattle and was involved in some fundraising activities on behalf of various institutions together with him. So the legacy continues there.
That's wonderful. I want to hear more about that. We'll do that by email.
I just want to make one point.
Yeah.
The legacy wasn't lost, and it didn't end. And what I know this is going to sound counterintuitive, but whatever Orthodox institutions exist in that part of Brooklyn today, they were a direct result and a continuation.
That's
No
wonderful.
break. And
what you're doing today, Diana.
And there's a lot more to be said. Individuals and family, the Golumbic family that had the big spice warehouse at Eastern Parkway.
info.
So another time.
Hi, it's Jane Downey. I have a quick question.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Hi, Diana. It was marvelous. It was wonderful. Thanks for inviting all of us. So my question is, you asked us to think of an object in our grandparents' house.
To that.
Where does it go to?
Did you think of something?
Yeah, it was my grandmother, but it wasn't in her house. She stayed at our house.
But what the object of your quilt? Was it your grandmother's quilt?
Yeah, that was my great-grandmother's quilt. But no, this was my grandmother that when we would go to school, she would ask us to thread the needles and stick them in the arm of the chair so she could sew all day while we were away.
Ah.
So I remember those needles, and I remember her knitting us mittens.
Oh, that's wonderful. I really regret that I didn't pick up that thread. I wanted to go back and close with that, and I forgot. So you helped me, Jane.
Well, that sounds like a perfect way to close the meeting. If anybody has any further comments before we adjourn, floor is open.
I'd love to hear from people if they want to continue the conversation through email. I'll say goodbye.
Okay, I am going to save the chat before I close down the conference. Let's see if there are any more comments. Just some thanks to you, Diana.
And thank you, David.
Doch hab nur Mut, es wird sein gut, kommt euch der Tag, du wirst sein frei, frei.